Hi, this is MC Shetty for a new modding tutorial for 1.15, and in this tutorial I'm going to talk about capabilities. So let's first demonstrate the effect that I want to implement using them, and then I'll explain how it works in code. First, I would also like to mention that there is documentation on capabilities in read the docs in this link. Unfortunately, though, it's not completely updated to 1.15. For example, it still mentions has capability, which no longer exists, and there are a few other things, but in any case, it's a good guideline to start with. There is some useful information there, and the documentation is also being worked on, so hopefully this will be updated really soon. So what does this do? Say you have a cow. If you then attack the cow with gunpowder, you can see you get a special message. You can charge the cow with gunpowder, and then let's kill it now. Don't run away, please. Yeah, so a charged cow will explode, or charged creature will explode. Say, let's charge it a lot more. Let's insert our entire. Also notice the particle effect. Voila. So you see you get a really big crater. It's just a fun effect, it doesn't really do anything. You see I experimented with it right here as well. So that's what we are going to make today. So what are capabilities? If you go to the official documentation, it explains it pretty well. They allow exposing features in a dynamic and flexible way without having to resort to directly implementing many interfaces. So we've seen the use of capabilities in our tile entities, for example. Let me show you that. So here we have an item handler and energy storage, which are both capabilities that are provided by Forge. And in this case, we implement these capabilities directly in our tile entity. So it's our own tile entity, and then it's very simple to just implement these capabilities by overriding get capability. And because that works, because tile entity is actually a capability provider. However, in this example, what we want to do now is to attach a capability to something, to a class we don't own, like a vanilla mob or even a modded mob or something else. And that's the power of capabilities. You can attach it to entities, item stacks, tile entities, chunks, and to the world itself. So it's a way to attach arbitrary data and logic to something you don't own or something that you do own, and it also allows communication, intermod communication between given by the API of the capability. We don't need that for our example, but it's possible. So everything related to capabilities I put in this map. So first we start with the basic API that we want to encapsulate. In case of the Forge capabilities, this represents, for example, item handler, which is a common API for Forge capability, and this is our interface. So what the capabilities system basically allows us to do is to dynamically attach this API, these two methods, to anything that supports capabilities. In our case, we want to add it to entities. We also have a default implementation of this interface, which is very simple. It just remembers the charge. And for item handler, I also always show the equivalent how it is in Forge. The default implementation is actually item stack handler. So that's how it works there. Then to make it work as a capability, you also need the actual capability class, and this is done. These are these two lines. This capability inject, it's a Forge annotation, and it will fill this capability at initialization time so that you can use it. So it starts with null, but it will by this injection be changed to the actual capability. So this will be the class that you will actually use. Also, this is equivalent for Forge item handler. So inside this class we also have a static register method, and this we call from our mod setup here in the initialization. And what it does is it initializes this capability by registering it to the capability manager. With this is our interface. This is a storage, so that's how capabilities can be persisted to NBT, because we need to remember this. Also, this is wrong. Should be charge instead. It doesn't really matter, just a variable name. But I want it to be consistent to what it actually represents. So it just remembers, so that when the world is saved and the entity is saved, this tag will be saved along it. There's more that you need to do to persist, but I will come to that in a moment. So what you also want to do, so for example, this defines the capability, but as soon as a mob entity spawns, a new entity spawns, we want to attach our capability to it. And that happens, so we have these three events: attach capabilities event, on attack event, and on def event. So this is called when an entity is created. Attach capabilities event for entity. You can also use this for chunk, for tile entity, for world, and so on. Not for world, for chunk. Yeah, for world as well. And if it's a creature, we get a provider, and we do add capability and add listener. So let me explain this. Entity charge provider is actually it's a capability provider, but we use capability serializable because we also want to save and load. So how does this work? Our entity charge provider has an instance of default entity charge, so this will actually be the instance that contains our charge. We also have a lazy optional of that, and in the get capability we just return that lazy optional cast to the right type. We have serialize and deserialize. These are from this interface, and they actually delegate serialization to our capability, which will eventually call these. These tests are there for safety, because in rare cases it might happen that this is not initialized yet, so better be safe than sorry. There is also an invalidate here. I will tell you what that does in a moment. So this is an important thing. So when an entity is created, this event will be fired, and you will get a chance to attach an entity, a capability provider to that entity. And you do that by calling event.addCapability with a certain mod ID, so it can be recognized, and the provider. You also attach a listener. This listener is fired if you go look at the documentation. Here. When the attached object is invalidated, so when the entity goes away, is destroyed, this will cause our invalidate to be called so that we can clean up the lazy optional. This is important because if something else gets our capability and stores it in a variable, invalidate will make sure that that capability becomes invalid and can no longer be used. Otherwise, we would have a dangling reference. So that's important you do it this way. Now, this is responsible for attaching the event and for also destroying it, for attaching the capability and also destroying it when the entity goes away. So to do something with that capability, we have these events. So whenever the entity is attacked, so if the attacker is a player, if the player is holding gunpowder, and then if the target has our capability, then we get the charge, we increase it, we set a new charge, we send a status message to the player, we shrink, we remove one gunpowder, and we set this new stack to the main hand. We cancel the attack event so that the mob is not damaged, and we add a particle effect. So every time you hit a mob with gunpowder, this will happen, and it uses our capability. And then when the mob dies, we also check if there is our capability. If present, we get the charge. If it's greater than 0, we create an explosion at the position of the entity with a charge with a radius that depends on the charge. We're using this calculation. So that's pretty easy. And these events are added here, like that. So that's basically all there is to it. This is a pretty simple example of using capabilities. There are a few things you need to be aware of. That's this one. Make sure to invalidate whenever the thing you added the capability to goes away, and the easiest way to do that is using event.addListener. Make sure also your provider, if you want to remember, if you want to store data, you also need to implement these. If you don't need to store data, you can also directly use iCapability Provider instead. You don't need to use this one. So this one is only used if you actually want to store data. And that's basically it. If you follow this structure, you should be fine. To conclude this tutorial, I would like to also mention a few things you should be careful with and a few remarks in general. First, when we use these in our own tile entities, it should actually be better. Remove. So in remove, which is called when the tile entity is destroyed. Actually, it does call. Let me check. So normally you are responsible for cleaning up your lazy optionals like this. But I'm now wondering if this one will also do this. So let me check. So it will call invalidate caps in capability provider, which call this one, which will fire all the listeners. And these listeners these are given like that. So I'm not actually sure. Yeah, that's for attached capabilities event. So it doesn't actually, it removes, it will dispatch, remove the capabilities that are added externally from other mods to this tile entity, but not your own. as far as I can see, because these are not added through attach capability event. So normally you would be expected to do this. Here we don't have any, and here we don't have any either. So this is the proper way to do it. But very few mods actually do this. I must admit that my mods don't either. It doesn't hurt, it's actually better. Because the reason most mods don't do this, because usually when you work with capabilities, what you do mostly is you always call get capability directly. You don't restore the capability. You just call every time you need it, you call get capability and you act on it. So because you're not storing it, there's no need to listen to it becoming invalid. So that's why this actually works. And I think if you would actually have store, for example, an item handler to some tile entity, it might not actually work properly, because to be honest, mods aren't using it exactly like they should. So this is the proper way to do it. But because get capability is called so often, that's the consequence of that, it has to be very efficient. So in our get capability, we actually don't do this right. It's actually better. Well, it will amount to the same thing, but if you because equals, yeah, in this particular case it will be the same, but it might be somewhat better and more efficient to directly write this, because capabilities are singletons, so there cannot be you can compare them using direct reference. It's safe, and this is the best way to write get capability, just direct comparison, and don't forget super. Don't try to make clever tricks like with maps and so on. This is the fastest way to do it. Also, one thing you should never do, because that defeats the entire purpose, never do something like instead of storing our handler here, what am I missing? Item handler. Hold on, let me. Yeah. Yeah. So never always store your lazy optional as a field in your tile entity, for example. Never do this, because every time some other tile entity will want to insert, like a hopper, for example, will want to insert something in your tile entity, it will call get capability, and this will create a new instance of lazy optional every time, again and again. So that's very heavy on object creation, and it also defeats the purpose. Lazy optional actually caches. For example, this supplier here, it's only fired the first time, so you can do an object creation here. It's not a problem. It will be evaluated just once. So only do it like this. Always store your capability, your lazy optionals elsewhere. For example, I also did this in the entity charge provider. I store it here. I don't in the get capability, I don't create it here. I don't do lazy optional dot off in here. Always store the lazy optional. That's the best way to do this. So a few rules in general. Try to be careful calling invalidate when needed. In case of something that is attached using this event, you can do that using the listener. That's what it's for. In case it's a tile entity or something you own, it's best to do it like this, for example. Those are the safe ways to do this. Also, make sure your get capability is very efficient. Try to do it like this. And don't create objects in get capability. Use fields from your class. So as I said before, Forge itself has 3 capabilities. Capability item handler, capability fluid handler, and capability energy. Those are the 3 capabilities that are supported by Forge itself. But you can, of course, make your own. So this concludes the capability tutorial. If you have any questions or any remarks, feel free to ask, and I will see what I can do to answer them. So, see you next time. Bye bye.